Hello to all of our TMD listeners. Welcome to our TMD talk, Race to the Bottom, a different conversation. Now, I am so excited and privileged to have a wonderful colleague and friend, Eliza Hurst, joining this very important conversation this morning. But first, my name is Dr. Julius Mullen, and I am the Chief Clinical Officer for Children and Families First. So we're going to go ahead and jump right into this race conversation. We are hoping that we certainly get to the bottom layers of this very, very critical conversation in our world today. Once again, I'm very excited and privileged to have Eliza Hurst with us today. I love calling her Esquire. She is an amazing attorney in our state and in our country. And I want to officially welcome Eliza Hurst.
Well, thank you, Dr. J, because that's what I always call you, is Dr. J.
I love it. Love it. Thank you. So Eliza, let's go ahead and jump in. Can you share just a little bit about yourself, and particularly as it relates to race and your background and upbringing and so forth and so on? Let's kind of share who is in the room here.
Sure. Well, I am a white woman who grew up in a family with two parents and a sister. I grew up in a family that is Jewish, and I do want to just mention that my grandmother was a Holocaust survivor, so that experience weighed very heavily on my family growing up. And I was raised Jewish, and race was always a conversation in our household. And I think part of that's because when my grandmother emigrated to the United States, very interestingly, you get your age, your gender, and your race when you emigrate, and her race said Hebrew. So I think about the construct of race as something that is often fluid, but also kind of fixed in some ways. So if being Hebrew is a race, that's not the same kind of immutable characteristic as being Black or having skin color or differences that are more notable. So I think of my version of maybe being an ethnic minority is somewhat kind of secret, because it only comes out if I want to mention that I have a minority status in some way. But I also grew up in a family that is filled with social activism. So my parents would take me to civil rights marches, women's rights marches. Passover is a big holiday in Jewish culture, and every Passover, it's a springtime holiday that commemorates the enslavement of Jews thousands of years ago. But our family would always read the I Have a Dream speech by Martin Luther King, Dr. King. And so we always talked about the context of what's going on in current day. And so I went through my life. I had a pretty loving, nurturing family. I went to law school to become a social justice activist. And from there, I worked for community legal aid, working on housing issues at first in the Hilltop neighborhood. And then I did a lot of activism, poverty law, essentially helping with entitlement benefits, special education. And prior to coming to Children and Families First, I worked with youth in foster care. So much of my life, I've noticed that I'm very lucky, I'm really privileged, but with that comes a great sense, at least the upbringing I've had, to give back and make sure that other people have the same kind of opportunities that I've had. Dr. J, you want to talk about yourself?
Sure. First, thank you for that very nice introduction. But more importantly, the world, our state, our community is certainly fortunate and lucky to have you in this particular space and advocating for so many children that otherwise may not have been or had the opportunities to dream and to believe, regardless of their background. So thank you for sharing your background, but also your contributions and your continuous contributions to the world, particularly children and families in Delaware. So I grew up in rural Sussex, Delaware, southern Delaware, in Ellendale. and I was raised by a Pentecostal deacon. I remember, oh my gosh, we went to church, seems like every day, but it was Tuesday and Thursday and Sunday. And when I say Sunday, I'm talking about all day Sunday. So much of my childhood was certainly, spent between the walls of the church. Um, but also, I often say that I grew up a rich kid without a dime in my pocket because, I mean, it was a single 57-year-old man when I first moved in at 2 weeks old, which still baffles me. What would encourage a 57-year-old man to say yes to raising a 2-week-old infant? But anyway, I think I grew up with a great deal of prosperity because all the rich values and lessons and direction that my grandfather made sure, I was a part of without saying many words. He was a very introverted person, but he showed the way through his actions. So, Ellendale was, and I hope anyway, continues to be a very small, pretty typical rural, small town USA. Not a lot of resources. The community sort of wrapped itself around the kids in the community. Kind of took care of everybody. Everybody knew each other's family and background. We all had the same challenges. Not a lot of money, not a lot of resources, but a tremendous amount of love and connection. So I grew up in the Milford School District, and I had a speech impediment where I stuttered tremendously. So I was very introverted. I really didn't have much to say all the way through my school years. I really enjoyed the game of basketball, so that was a safe haven for me, and the bright lights kind of introduced me to the world, being on a basketball court. And I owe the game of basketball so much because it certainly played a huge role in my development, particularly early on. So yeah, I went through the Milford School District and went to the local community college, Delaware Technical and Community College, and then Wilmington University, and kind of grappled through the higher education process to achieving my doctorate, which was certainly not the norm in my community circle. So proud to be in this space of counseling and education and mentoring and community advocacy. But I really only do three things. I try to encourage and empower and educate, particularly the underdogs. So we have some similarities. There are some notable differences as well. And I hope it sets the tone for a very rich conversation. There are no specific agendas or rigid goals. I just hope that we engage and we just have a natural conversation where we listen and learn and maybe decide what's next for us, particularly around this conversation around race. So let's jump in a little deeper. Can you talk about your own racial identity, and with an emphasis on what are you proud of as it relates to who you are and your racial makeup, if you will?
I think that it's such a loaded term, and I don't know if a short conversation will ever do it justice, but I think a lot about how growing up, I was often around people that looked like me, and education was always the most important thing in my family. So every single member of my immediate family and my cousins and aunts and uncles all went to college. A lot of them are doctors, either medical doctors or PhDs, or there are a couple lawyers, but they all emphasize education as the most important thing. But I also went to schools where either I was somewhat considered a minority being Jewish, or it was me and just a handful of kids that were of students of color at the time. And so I thought more about my racial identity, I think, when I got to college, because I actually went to the first liberal arts college in the country that was co-ed and also admitted people of color. And they, as far as a liberal arts college, it was fairly diverse. I went to Oberlin College. And I think when I got to college, that's where I started to understand a little bit more what it's like to be in different places or have people with a lot of different challenges and backgrounds. And I think from there, I started to realize that it's helpful, healthy, and okay to go into communities or situations where not everyone looks like you.
Mm.
And so for me, I think I started to think more about, what does racial identity mean? I think about it from the perspective of, when I was in high school, there were maybe 4 Black students in my class or so. And when I got to college, there were more. And then in law school, thankfully, there were more still. But when I think about the jobs I've had, I regularly went into churches, community centers, people's homes, people that didn't look anything like me. And it got me thinking about how oftentimes I never really thought about race. I kind of took it for granted that I could blend
Yeah.
in. And maybe sometimes being female was a bigger difference, especially in the legal field. And as I started to understand more that when I go into people's homes or churches or community centers, I'm the only white person there. And so it gave me great perspective on what it must be like. And I will never fully understand. So I want to make that clear, but at least a little bit of an understanding of how it feels when you're the only person that looks like who you are, or the only gender. And so I think that was really helpful in helping me be more empathetic and compassionate to what people of color in particular, or people who don't look like everyone else or act like everyone else, how they are when they go out into the world.
I was, I really respect you for saying that and acknowledging that particular circumstance, Eliza, because I've certainly been in like situations, where the construct or the centerpiece was race, where I was the only, a man, a particularly Black man, or even African American in the room, and it's almost like, and I constantly feel that way and experience certain dynamics. It's almost like going in a complete different country at times, where you not only look different, but you perhaps have a different background, you think different, you speak different, the language is different. So this is process of trying to assimilate, but through that, sometimes it's very stressful. For me, race and gender has been the centerpiece of my existence, my functioning. And as I was, listening to you explain your experience, it hit me also that my racial identity now is much more pronounced than growing up. And I don't know whether or not it was because I was just around, particularly my community and home, people who look like me and speak like me and think like me, or maybe I didn't know, I didn't have the cognitive or the intellectual history and background and education and social media. I think social media continues to play an incredible role compared to then and now. So I know more and I see more, and all the all the unfortunate circumstances and situations, particularly toward Black men, much more pronounced now. So that introspective process of looking at my racial identity is much more pronounced now than ever before. It's very interesting to think about that, as I, kind of make that contrast.
What ways do you think well, first, let me ask you a question. So I think about this a lot, that when we think about identity, it's always really helpful to ask, how do you identify? Because some people prefer certain terminology or don't prefer certain terminology. So when you think of your racial identity, is there a word or how you define yourself? Do you define yourself, so for example, as an African American male or a Black male, or is there another word that you often prefer?
That's a very good question, and I get that question a lot. And uh, for me, because I think that that impression is so personal, and it speaks to the deeper level of subcultural thinking and perceptions. For me, I'm sort of indifferent around whether, at least as it relates to whether I have the label of a Black person or a person who's Black or an African American person. Based on those specific labels, I'm sort of indifferent. I feel the same way about each of them. So I don't have a particular preference. Yeah.
That's really helpful. And I often find if I can have those conversations where you're building your relationship or rapport with someone, to ask them what they prefer, because I think one of the most painful pieces of trying to confront and do better and move forward is the concern of making assumptions about someone just because of what they look like or how they act. But how do you think what you identify, your racial identity, how has that impacted your personal life and your professional life?
Yeah, good question. I was sharing with somebody the other day, race more so now in recent years. My racial identity has played and continue to play an incredible impact on every single setting that I tend to go into, whether I'm in a restaurant or in training or traveling to a different town. That racial identity lens goes into almost automatic instant detection mode. How many Black folks are in this place? Or I do a quick scan, in terms of do I see people who look like me? And usually it's generated through the lens of race. So I carry that racial identity informally and informally, indirectly and directly, every single space I go into, either professionally or personally. That's a constant internalized dynamic, and that I make instant, decisions around how should I act, how should I speak, how should I behave, and based on this construct of race. So it plays an incredible impact, and the psychological wear and tear at times is unbearable, because sometimes, whether it's just me, or whether it's real, or um, either way, it doesn't matter, because the way I perceive it is real. Sometimes, depending on what's going on, I go into that fight, flight, and freeze mode, depending on circumstance, but it's usually driven by this thing that we call race. So I'm always on the race uh, construct or the race situation. And I make some pretty major decisions every single day based on race.
It's interesting you bring that up, because I would say both you, Dr. J, and I have spent a lot of time advocating for trauma-informed practices and trying to make sure people understand how trauma can change the brain and behavior. And when you talked about being always on, thinking about how your race can play out in a situation, whether you're safe, whether there are people who are similar to you, or whether you might be different or in an unsafe similarity with also people who've experienced significant trauma, that it's that same fear response center of always asking, am I safe at every moment? And it sometimes can make it hard to relax and look at what's going on around you if you're just looking at safety as your primary focus. Have you ever had a moment where you've felt really different in a group setting because of your race? you kind of alluded to it, but I was curious if you had an example or a moment.
Eliza, and I think I speak for not all, but I speak for many. For many people who look like me, particularly African Americans or people who are different from what we call mainstream or status quo or the general population demographics. I have worn this mask every single day, particularly in the professional arena. And many people wear a mask that is a really thick mask that really separates who you really are. And I shamefully explain this, but it's so true. Who you really are as it relates to who you think you should be in the professional arena. So you put on a mask and you go into this super ego, alter ego, different ego state of how you speak, how you talk, how you behave, how you interact, how you write and send an email, how you double and triple check what you write in your emails, how you go through this preliminary processing before you share an idea, if you share an idea at all. But it's based on that being behind this mask. So yeah, it's a very real dynamic. What about you?
I'll say a couple things. I think similarly, being a female in the legal profession, not so much now, but early on, I think also I tended to look very young. Good genes, I guess, I don't know. But I often wonder the same thing, that if what's coming out of my mouth, are people going to take me seriously?
Yeah.
Because I either look really young, I'm petite, or because I'm female. But I think in terms of race, I think of a couple stories I could tell really quickly, where one, I think I took advantage of it, and one where it was difficult. So I remember my kids were like 5 and 7 years old, and I was in court all day in Sussex County, and I live in Newcastle County. And I was driving home, and I was right near their school. My kids were in aftercare. It was like 5:55, and the aftercare program closed at 6. And I knew my kids were going to be exhausted because I had to drop them off at 7:45 a.m. that morning. So I felt like a horrible parent. My heart's pounding. I'm trying to get there. And there was a backup on the turn to get to their road. And so I just took some liberties and I went on the shoulder, and there was a state trooper right next to me. So he pulled me over. And I realized at that moment, not only am I like stressed out and sweating, but now I might be late for aftercare. So my kids are going to be devastated. I'm going to have to pay extra. And he said, I needed a license and registration. I thought, oh my God, I left it in the trunk of my car. Well, being a lawyer, I understand what this means, but I also recognize as a white female in a minivan, I probably didn't pose any kind of implicit bias threat to the police officer. So as stressed out and nervous as I am, I asked the police officer, can I go and get my wallet? I accidentally left it in my trunk. And it wasn't lost on me that if I were a male or a person of color, that could have opened up a situation that could have been stressful for both me and the police officer. And so it was one of those moments where I recognized that because of my gender and because of my race, that something wasn't as stressful as it probably could have been. And I got a ticket, I paid it. It was fine. But the other example I can think of where I felt really different, or where there was something really stressful, is as part of my job representing youth in foster care, my greatest role is to try to help siblings stay together and help them reunify with their family, because that's the least traumatic thing we can do for kids. And I had a group of 3 siblings who grandmom and grandpop really wanted them, and the kids were all placed in separate homes. And so I went to go and see grandparents, and oftentimes when I'm doing part of my legal advocacy as a child attorney, I do investigations. So I'm going to go and meet the family in their home. And when I walk in to the house, I see a Confederate flag on the wall. And then when I walked into one of the bedrooms, I saw a Nazi flag on the wall.
Oh,
And
good.
that immediately sent me into that same fear response center of, this is not a safe home for me. These people don't necessarily know my background. But I had to really push through and think about what was in the best interest of the three kids. And these grandparents were devoted, loving, wonderful grandparents. And I had seen them interact with the kids. And so I had to put aside my fear response, my bias against these hateful symbols that I saw, to say, what's the best thing for these kids? Sure, I don't want kids growing up in a home that has some hateful rhetoric or hateful symbols, but is it far better for them to be in foster care separated from each other as siblings, or be in a home where they're loved and nurtured, and hopefully they will get critical thinking skills to say, you know what, that's not what I agree with. But being in those kinds of moments, it makes me think, it's stressful, but if you sometimes can separate out something you see that is hateful, discriminatory, or racist from the person, and see if there's maybe other good side to them, I think you can start to build a rapport and maybe move beyond some of the hateful and discriminatory actions and rhetoric that we're often seeing. That's not to minimize the extensive trauma that people suffer, especially because of historic racism. But I always worry that an example like what I just gave you is, if I had shut down because of just seeing those hateful symbols, I might not have been able to help those kids achieve permanency. And I worry that in our society today, sometimes we shut down conversation if someone disagrees with us, or they say something that is that conversation, or tell them how it makes you feel and why it's hurtful, in a way that you can move forward.
Wow. That's such a powerful example, Eliza, because it really illuminates or emphasizes that intersection. And I know you're doing a lot of work on the intersection with race or racism and trauma, and what it means in the professional space and your particular roles. And that was a really, really powerful example about how you had to go through a very quick but internal process, and really trying to move through that moment and move through your own intra stressors and trauma, and I like what you said in terms of really trying to see something different and understand that there's more to this person than what you think you may see. Particularly, there's a larger benefit and ethical obligation, if you will, in terms of really trying to take care of the kids and do what's best for these kids. I'm well aware that our time is winding down. This is certainly part one of a deeper dive conversation that we will continue. We will go much more deep and talking about the intersection and the relationship between racism and trauma, because people are asking a lot of questions about, are they different? Are they the same? Are there correlations? Should they be talked about within the same context? So we're going to go to much more deep in that particular space for part two. But before we wrap up, I wonder, were there any cringe moments for you, or uncomfortable moments, if you will, during this conversation? Because I think it's very healthy for people to talk about the cringe moments and don't silence them and bring them to the surface. Anything comes to mind?
I didn't find any cringe moments, except for me, I don't always talk about my background, so it always makes me a little uncomfortable to bring that up. But I also think that you don't move forward in relationships unless you're expressing some vulnerability. How about for you? Any cringe moments or uncomfortable moments?
I guess for me, it's the story that you told about when you seen seeing those flags and how you were able to instantly and cognitively move to a different space quickly. And I've been in those situations, a different context, but very similar situations. And it wasn't, it was much more of a challenge for me internally. And I played the part, but internally it was much more of a challenge for me to constantly be able to see through those particular stressors that I experienced inside. So a different type of cringe moments, but as you were telling that story, I kind of put myself in those scenarios that, that I've been in many, many times. So Eliza, once again, nothing but gratitude for you spending some time and sharing your expertise, but not only that, sharing much more about you, particularly your background and your upbringing and your perspectives about race. I look forward to continuing this conversation with you, and much gratitude to you. Thank you so much, Esquire. Appreciate it.
Well, I thank you too, and I'm so grateful and humble to have you as my friend, Dr. J.
Likewise. Take care. I'll see you soon.